When Japan surrendered on the 15th of August 1945, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero was no longer the feared aircraft it had once been, but its name still carried enormous weight. At the start of the war, the Zero had dominated the skies over the Pacific. It outmaneuvered, outclimbed, and outturned almost everything the Allies had. Pilots who faced it in the early years described it with a mix of respect and disbelief. It seemed to defy physics. It could loop tighter than any American fighter. It could appear out of nowhere, strike hard, and disappear again before anyone could react. But by 1944 and 1945, the war had changed. American aircraft had improved dramatically. The Zero's weaknesses, especially its lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, became fatal against stronger and faster US fighters. Many Japanese pilots were inexperienced by this point. The air bases were bombed daily. Fuel was scarce. And the Zero, once the symbol of Japanese air power, had been pushed to the edge of collapse. When the Emperor announced Japan's surrender, hundreds of Zeros were still sitting on runways inside hangars, scattered in fields, or hidden in forests. Many were damaged, many were unflyable. Some had been cannibalized for parts. Others had almost no fuel left. Pilots stood beside their aircraft in silence, listening to the announcement over crackling loudspeakers, realizing their war was over and their beloved fighter would never fly in combat again. The Zero had been central to Japan's wartime identity. Propaganda had celebrated it. Pilots had trained for years to fly it with precision and pride. Now the aircraft represented defeat, destruction, and a future that no one could fully imagine. After surrender, Japan received strict orders from the Allies. All military aircraft were grounded. No Zero was allowed to take off. Pilots were told to wait for the arrival of American occupation forces. Some squadrons buried documents, flight logs, and technical manuals. Others tried to hide working aircraft in mountain hangars or remote airstrips, hoping to preserve them from destruction or capture. There were even a few who couldn't bear to see their Zero taken by the enemy and set it on fire themselves. But most Zeros simply sat where they were. Their engines cooled. Their paint faded under the late summer sun. Their fuel lines dried. Their propellers stopped turning forever. The aircraft that once defined Japan's wartime spirit now waited for the Americans to arrive. When American forces finally entered Japan and inspected the airfields, they found rows of Zeros sitting silently. Some were intact, some were burned, some were so battered that they looked like skeletons of their former selves. But even in this condition, the Zero fascinated them. It was one of the most studied enemy aircraft of the entire war. Now, for the first time, Americans could walk right up to them, touch them, and decide what to do with the most iconic Japanese fighter ever built. This was the beginning of a story that would send Zeros across the Pacific into research labs, scrap yards, warehouses, and eventually museums and movies. What happened next would determine the fate of every Zero aircraft still standing in 1945. What the Americans found when they reached Japan's airfields. When American occupation forces landed in Japan in late 1945, one of their first tasks was to secure airfields across the country. These were not polished military bases anymore. Many had been bombed repeatedly, others were deserted. Some looked like open graveyards for aircraft, but almost all of them still held at least a few Zeros. American officers approached these airfields with a mix of curiosity and caution. During the war, the Zero had been one of the most analyzed enemy planes in American intelligence briefings. Pilots wrote reports about its speed and maneuverability. Navy engineers studied captured parts. Newspapers exaggerated its abilities. It had become a symbol of Japan's airborne threat. Now the Americans were about to see the aircraft up close in its homeland. The scene they encountered varied from base to base. At larger airfields like Atsugi, where the Americans made one of their earliest and most important landings, rows of Zeros sat lined up neatly, as if waiting for a mission that would never come. Some were freshly painted, others were worn, dented, or stripped for parts. A few had bullet holes patched with tin sheets. Their canopies were clouded from age and rough maintenance. At smaller regional strips, Zeros were in far worse condition. Mechanics had scavenged engines, fuel pumps, armament panels, and anything else that could be used to keep other planes flying during the final months of the war. Some airframes had been dragged into hangars, then forgotten during frantic evacuations. Others were hidden behind barns or inside improvised shelters because local officers hoped to preserve one last trace of Japan's air force. American engineers and intelligence officers moved quickly. They photographed every Zero they found. They measured wingspans, fuselage angles, and control surfaces. They opened access panels and inspected wiring. Some Zeros still had fuel in their tanks. Others had engines that could be coaxed into turning over. But most had sat idle for weeks or months and would need serious work to fly again. The Americans were interested in more than just airframes. They collected every document they could find: maintenance logs, blueprints, pilot manuals, engine test sheets, even scribbled notes found inside cockpits. What they discovered helped them understand how Japan had sustained its aircraft program under conditions that had grown more desperate each year. They found evidence of innovation, improvisation, and also decline. Early production Zeros were built with remarkable craftsmanship, using lightweight materials like the famous extra-strong aluminum alloy known as extra super duralumin. Late war Zeros showed the strain of a failing empire. Rivets were misaligned. Paint was uneven. Equipment was downgraded or missing entirely. Some late engines looked like they had been pushed way past their limits. American intelligence teams realized they had arrived just in time. Another few months of war, and there might not have been much left to study. Within days, the Americans began selecting which Zeros to ship back to the United States. They wanted airworthy examples, unique variants, and aircraft that represented different years of production. These would be tested, dissected, and compared to American aircraft to understand not only the Zero itself, but the industrial world that produced it. This marked the beginning of a remarkable journey. Zeros that had once defended Japan would soon be loaded onto American carriers, strapped to cargo ships, or broken down for transport. Their next chapter would take them far from the airfields where they had once been the pride of Japan's military. How the Americans captured, tested, and shipped Zeros to the United States. Once American forces identified intact Zeros across Japan, the next step was deciding which ones were worth saving. Not every Zero could make the trip. Many had been stripped for parts. Others had sat in the sun too long, their engines seized and their airframes beginning to corrode. But a select group stood out as valuable. Intelligence teams wanted Zeros that represented different production runs. Early war models, mid-war upgrades, and late-war units built under extreme pressure. They also wanted rare variants, such as the A6M5, which had thicker wings and improved exhaust stacks, or the A6M3, with shorter wings designed for better roll rate. Each version told a story about Japan's shifting industrial capabilities and wartime priorities. The Americans also singled out Zeros with complete engine assemblies. The Sakai radial engine fascinated them. It was light, responsive, and cleverly designed for maneuverability. American engineers had studied captured engines before, but never in the quantity now available. Once selected, the work of getting these Zeros operational began. This was no easy task. Many Zeros had been grounded for months. Fuel lines were dry, tires were cracked. Magnetos were unreliable, cockpits were dusty, and filled with paperwork from the last desperate days of the war. American mechanics and engineers, often working alongside Japanese ground crews, who were now under occupation authority, replaced hoses, cleaned carburetors, drained old fuel, and inspected every control cable. Some Zeros were coaxed into running with surprisingly little effort. Others needed major repairs before they could even taxi. At a few airfields, something remarkable happened. American pilots actually flew captured Zeros in Japan before shipping them home. These test flights were careful and controlled. Pilots had strict instructions: no aerobatics, no aggressive maneuvers, and no pushing the airframe. The objective was simply to confirm flight characteristics and engine reliability. For American pilots who had fought the Zero in combat, Flying one was a surreal experience. These were the planes they had once feared. Now they sat in the cockpit, adjusting the seat, checking the throttle, and seeing firsthand how the aircraft handled in the air. Many came away with deep respect for the aircraft's responsiveness and lightness. Shipping the Zeros to the United States required careful planning. Some aircraft were dismantled into major components, wings removed, tail sections detached, engines crated separately. These were loaded onto cargo ships or aircraft carriers for transport across the Pacific. Others, especially those in better condition, were simply rolled onto carriers and tied down on deck. Photographs from late 1945 and early 1946 show lines of captured Japanese aircraft, including Zeros, arranged neatly on American ship decks, sitting quietly among American planes as they made the long crossing. On set, they reached the United States. The Zeros were distributed to testing facilities, such as Naval Air Station Patuxent River, Wright Field in Ohio, and various Navy research units. Engineers ran them through wind tunnel analysis, engine tests, and flight trials. They compared them directly to American aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair. The Americans learned a great deal from these tests, not because the Zero was still superior, but because it revealed how Japan had pushed lightweight design to its limits. These insights helped shape American understanding of aerodynamics, materials science, and the trade-offs between agility and protection. By 1947, most surviving Zeros in the United States had completed their testing. Some were stored. Some were scrapped. A few were kept for display or future research. Their new lives had begun. What happened to Japan's aircraft factories after the war? When Japan surrendered, aircraft factories across the country faced an immediate and absolute halt. The industry that had once produced thousands of fighters, bombers, trainers, and engines, each year was frozen in place. Workers arrived to find that production orders had vanished overnight. Engineers no longer had designs to refine. Assembly lines stopped mid-motion. Tools lay where they had been dropped on the day of surrender. Japan's industrial landscape was enormous at the height of the war. Companies like Mitsubishi, Nakajima, Aichi, Kawanishi, and Tachikawa ran sprawling facilities that employed tens of thousands of people. Aircraft production had been one of the main pillars of the wartime economy. Now all of it had to be dismantled. The Allied occupation forces, led by the Americans, made this a priority. The new policy was clear. Japan would no longer be allowed to build military aircraft of any kind. The goal was to prevent the country from ever returning to militarism. This meant breaking down the entire production system that had built the Zero and every other Japanese aircraft. Occupation officers arrived at the factories with detailed instructions. They conducted inspections, catalogued machinery, and issued orders for dismantling. Some equipment was seized and shipped to the United States as war prizes, but most of it was destroyed on site. Lathes, mills, presses, and specialized tools were cut apart, smashed, or melted down. Anything that could be used to manufacture aircraft components had to be eliminated. For the workers, this was a moment of fear and uncertainty. Many had spent their entire careers in aviation production. They knew no other trade. Now they watched their machines reduced to scrap, unsure how they would support their families. Massive layoffs followed. Communities built around aviation were suddenly without income. The factories themselves did not vanish entirely. Many were repurposed. Mitsubishi, for example, shifted to producing household appliances, machinery, and later automobiles. Nakajima Aircraft was reorganized into a new company that eventually became Fuji Heavy Industries, known today as Subaru. Kawanishi, which had built seaplanes, transformed into Shinmaiwa, latter Shinmaiwa, which eventually returned to aviation, but only for civilian and rescue aircraft decades later. But at the time, none of this was clear. In 1945 and 1946, these companies were simply trying to survive. Engineers who had once designed cutting-edge fighters now found themselves working on sewing machines, bicycles, farm tools, or whatever civilian goods were in demand during the occupation. The physical spaces also changed. Former runways became farmland. Hangars became storage facilities. Assembly halls became workshops for completely unrelated products. The transformation was total and symbolic. The factories that had produced the Zero were being stripped of their ability to create war. By the late 1940s, Japan's aviation industry had been entirely dismantled. There was no legal aircraft production, no active engineering programs, no testing facilities. The skill and knowledge remained in people's minds, but the infrastructure was gone. For the Zero, this meant one thing: there would be no new Zeros, no spare parts, no replacements. Every surviving aircraft now belonged to the past, with no industrial future to support it. What Japan did with the remaining Zeros? When the war ended, Japan still had several hundred Zeros scattered across the country. Some sat on airfields that had been heavily bombed. Others were hidden in mountain hangars, farm sheds, or improvised shelters built in the final months of the war. A few were stored indoors at facilities that had escaped the worst of the destruction. No one knew exactly how many remained, but the number was far smaller than what Japan had started with. Under the terms of the Allied occupation, Japan was forced to disarm completely. Every military aircraft had to be surrendered, destroyed, or turned over to the Americans. This applied to Zeros as well, but how these aircraft were dealt with varied from place to place. In many cases, Zeros were simply destroyed on the spot. American troops ordered them to be burned, bulldozed, or cut apart. Some were lined up on runways and set on fire using gasoline and flammable cloth. Photographs from 1945 show thick black smoke rising from piles of aircraft, their wings collapsing as flames consumed the lightweight aluminum. It was a painful sight for mechanics and pilots who had spent years maintaining and flying these machines. Other Zeros were dragged into large pits dug near airfields. Bulldozers pushed them into trenches where they were smashed and buried under dirt. The goal was complete demilitarization, not preservation. Japan could not keep even a single operational Zero. Everything had to go. Some Zeros were scavenged before being destroyed. Civilians stripped fabric, aluminum, copper wiring, and steel components to sell on the black market or reuse for daily needs. A Zero's aluminum skin could be turned into pots, pans, and household items. Wires were used for repairs around homes. Tires and rubber parts became valuable materials in a country running short on everything. A small number of Zeros were spared temporarily. These were usually aircraft chosen by the Americans for analysis. They were inspected, catalogued, and sometimes flown, then transported overseas for testing. A few were kept intact as teaching tools for Japanese engineers, learning post-war manufacturing standards under American supervision. But most of these Zeros eventually ended up in storage or were scrapped when they were no longer needed. By the late 1940s, Japan's aviation industry had been entirely dismantled. There was no legal aircraft production, no active engineering programs, no testing facilities. The skill and knowledge remained in people's minds, but the infrastructure was gone. For the Zero, this meant one thing: there would be no new Zeros, no spare parts, no replacements. Every surviving aircraft now belonged to the past, with no industrial future to support it. What Japan did with the remaining Zeros when the war ended: Japan still had several hundred Zeros scattered across the country. Some sat on airfields that had been heavily bombed. Others were hidden in mountain hangars, farm sheds, or improvised shelters built in the final months of the war. A few were stored indoors at facilities that had escaped the worst of the destruction. No one knew exactly how many remained, but the number was far smaller than what Japan had started with. Under the terms of the Allied occupation, Japan was forced to disarm completely. Every military aircraft had to be surrendered, destroyed, or turned over to the Americans. This applied to Zeros as well. But how these aircraft were dealt with varied from place to place. In many cases, Zeros were simply destroyed on the spot. American troops ordered them to be burned, bulldozed, or cut apart. Some were lined up on runways and set on fire using gasoline and flammable cloth. Photographs from 1945 show thick black smoke rising from piles of aircraft, their wings collapsing as flames consumed the lightweight aluminum. It was a painful sight for mechanics and pilots who had spent years maintaining and flying these machines. Other Zeros were dragged into large pits dug near airfields. Bulldozers pushed them into trenches, where they were smashed and buried under dirt. The goal was complete demilitarization, not preservation. Japan could not keep even a single operational Zero. Everything had to go. Some Zeros were scavenged before being destroyed. Civilians stripped fabric, aluminum, copper wiring, and steel components to sell on the black market or reuse for daily needs. A Zero's aluminum skin could be turned into pots, pans, and household items. Wires were used for repairs around homes. Tires and rubber parts became valuable materials in a country running short on everything. A small number of Zeros were spared temporarily. These were usually aircraft chosen by the Americans for analysis. They were inspected, catalogued, and sometimes flown, then transported overseas for testing. A few were kept intact as teaching tools for Japanese engineers learning post-war manufacturing standards under American supervision. But most of these Zeros eventually ended up in storage or were scrapped when they were no longer needed. As the war dragged on, pilot training became shorter and less rigorous. By 1944, many pilots had only a fraction of the training that early war aviators received. When Japan surrendered, the surviving pilots fell into two broad groups. Some went home quietly. They returned to farms, small towns, and family businesses. They did not speak openly about the war. Many felt guilt for surviving when so many of their comrades died. Others carried the trauma of seeing friends vanish in flames. They simply wanted to disappear into civilian life. A smaller number became teachers, mechanics, or employees at the companies that would later evolve from wartime industries. A few eventually shared their stories with historians, but most chose silence. Their memories stayed locked away for decades. Now, let's look at the engineers and designers. Jiro Horikoshi, the lead designer of the Zero, was not put on trial. He was not considered a militarist leader or someone responsible for wartime aggression. He was an engineer who built an aircraft, not someone who made political decisions. But the end of the war left him in a strange position. His life's work had been dismantled. The aviation industry was gone. Japan was not allowed to design aircraft of any kind. Horikoshi and his team had to find new work. Horikoshi joined Mitsubishi's post-war engineering programs. He worked on household appliances, trains, and other civilian technologies. He had enormous technical knowledge but no aviation industry to return to. Like many engineers, he had to rebuild his career from scratch. Other members of the design team scattered into different companies. Some worked in shipbuilding, others entered the automotive sector. A few became university professors teaching engineering fundamentals. These engineers carried with them the lessons of designing lightweight, efficient, high-performance machines. Those same skills later contributed to Japan's post-war industrial boom. The precision and discipline required to build an aircraft like the Zero became the foundation for Japan's leadership in automobiles, electronics, and manufacturing. Thousands of mechanics and ground crew members also lost their livelihoods overnight. They had spent years maintaining Zeros under increasingly difficult conditions. After the war, many shifted to automotive repair, factory work, or small-scale metalworking. Some mechanics eventually helped Japan create new civilian aircraft decades later. When restrictions loosened, others never returned to aviation at all. The people who built and flew the Zero rarely talked about their past. They lived in a society eager to move on. Yet their skills influenced Japan's future more than most civilians realized. They were part of the quiet transformation that turned wartime industries into peaceful ones. The Zero disappeared from Japan, but the people who created it shaped the country that emerged afterward. By the early 1950s, almost every Zero in Japan had been destroyed. Factories had been dismantled. Airframes had been burned or buried. Pilots and engineers had moved on with their lives. Yet the Zero never completely vanished. A handful survived the war in surprising ways. Some were hidden. Some were shipped overseas. Others were simply forgotten. until someone rediscovered them years later. These scattered survivors became the foundation of a new chapter in the Zero's history. They would eventually appear in museums, restoration hangars, private collections, and even Hollywood films. During the occupation, American forces shipped several intact Zeros to the United States. These aircraft were used for testing, then stored in Navy warehouses. When the military no longer needed them, they ended up in museums or were sold as surplus. A few survived long enough to be restored by aviation enthusiasts. American museums like the Smithsonian, the San Diego Air and Space Museum, and the Plains of Fame Air Museum in California now hold some of the best preserved Zeros in the world. These aircraft often came from the batches tested at U.S. facilities just after the war. Some were maintained in flying condition, others became static displays, preserved exactly as they were found. Not every Zero was destroyed in Japan. Some were hidden by local villagers or former mechanics who wanted to save them for personal or sentimental reasons. They stashed them in mountain barns, underground shelters, or sealed storage spaces. In the decades after the war, collectors and historians found these forgotten aircraft. Most were heavily damaged by moisture and time, but their airframes were still valuable. Even wreckage from crash sites became sources for restoration projects. Outside Japan, Zeros sat abandoned on Pacific islands, such as Rabaul, New Guinea, and the Marshall Islands. These aircraft were left where they crashed, or were pushed aside after being captured. Many became overgrown by jungle or rusted in the tropical climate. Decades later, recovery teams salvaged what they could. Some pieces were used in full restorations. Others remained in situ as historical relics. By the 1960s and 1970s, filmmakers wanted realistic Japanese aircraft. For war movies, there were not enough surviving Zeros to meet demand, so directors turned to modified aircraft. The most famous example is the North American T-6 Texan, which was altered to resemble a Zero. These Hollywood Zeros appeared in films like Tora, and the Battle of Midway. They were not perfect replicas, but they helped keep the image of the Zero alive for new generations. Starting in the late 20th century, aviation restoration specialists began searching for authentic Zero parts to rebuild airworthy aircraft. These restorers combined original components with carefully reproduced parts. The goal was to recreate a true flying Zero, even if it required blending several wrecks into a single working aircraft. Places like Plains of Fame and the Commemorative Air Force undertook major restoration efforts. The Zero became one of the rarest flying warbirds in the world. Watching one fly today is a rare and emotional experience. The sound of the Sakai engine and the aircraft's graceful movements remind people how advanced the Zero was for its time. Museums in Japan also reclaimed their heritage. The Zero displayed at the Yushukan Museum in Tokyo and the one at the Tokorozawa Aviation Museum represent Japan's effort to preserve its aviation history with honesty and accuracy. The Zero went from feared weapon to historical exhibit. Its remains scattered across the world became artifacts that tell the story of war, innovation, desperation, and loss. Today, each preserved Zero is a reminder of the people who built it, the pilots who flew it, and the world that changed because of it.